Everybody wants to do things through email and text and very unpersonal in that regard. I've just taken it upon myself to get really good at talking to a seller or a buyer or anybody, quite honestly, depending on what the interaction is about that day, and get to the core. If I can figure out what that seller's needs are and I can solve their needs without having to use a bank or without having to use a lot of my cash, that's my goal.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB and Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com. Hello and welcome to episode 357. For the past 20 years, my guest today has been mastering negotiation techniques both on the phone and at the kitchen table. Creative deal structuring, including options, subject to purchases, lease options, and seller financing are what excites him. Derek Dombeck has been involved in thousands of transactions and has a knack for putting together creative deal structure and financing solutions that will help you think differently about the deals you might be working on now or in the future. Derek, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became a real estate investor, and when you started using some of these creative techniques.
So the very short version of the first half of my career, I was a construction worker, with a PhD, a public high school diploma. Like most of your listeners, probably, I bought a couple fixer-upper properties, and the intention was to keep properties for cash flow. I'm based in Wisconsin, so for the most part, what I was doing was here. And this started in 2003. But at the same time, my wife Tracy and I had started building new construction projects in Florida, which was all outsourced. And early on, everything we did was bank financed until 2007, when the markets crashed and the banking went, belly up. And that's when we realized how little control we had over our own business. So it was a very painful time in our life financially. We've got the scars to prove it. But that was really the turning point of when I decided, along with my wife, we either quit or we need to learn how to do it a different way. And that different way was getting creative and eventually raising private capital as well. But initially, it was learning how to talk to people so that you could structure deals that were win-win without using money or credit.
Give us an example of what you're talking about.
So most of the time, everybody that I interact with today, especially when we had cheap bank financing, they just automatically revert to price is everything, right? They're going to get the cheapest price they can from a seller, whether it's a listed property or an off-market property, and they never really interact with the seller as far as what the seller's true needs are. I look at using a bank or even using cash as a cash purchase as my second, third, or fourth option, because in many cases, price is not the primary goal of the seller. There's a lot of scenarios where it could be a death, a divorce, an illness, a job relocation. The list goes on and on and on, right? But we as a society, in my opinion, have gotten away from having conversations. Everybody wants to do things through email and text and very unpersonal in that regard. I've just taken it upon myself to get really good at talking to a seller or a buyer or anybody, quite honestly, depending on what the interaction is about that day, and get to the core. If I can figure out what that seller's needs are and I can solve their needs without having to use a bank or without having to use a lot of my cash, that's my goal.
How are you talking directly with the seller? Because most people, if they go through a traditional realtor or broker, don't really have any conversation with the seller.
Most of my marketing is direct to the seller. I do carry a real estate license. I could make offers through the MLS on my own. I make very few offers on the MLS for that very reason, because I want to talk to the seller. I do get referrals and stuff from other realtors, and I just flat out tell them, if you want me to make an offer on your listed property, I want to be able to have a conversation with the seller. Are you okay with that? And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. But ultimately, I want to get one-on-one, either over the phone or across the kitchen table from the seller.
So you make that as a stipulation. Like, if I'm going to make an offer, you have to let me talk with the seller directly. And if they say no, but you really want the property, do you still move forward, or you just say, nope, that's a deal killer, I'm not going to pursue it?
It doesn't happen that often, especially the last couple of years, because most real estate agents are listing properties that don't have a lot of challenges. Our niche is solving people's real estate problems, and the majority of the people I deal with are too embarrassed to list their property, or they've been told by realtors, don't list it until you spend X dollar amount of money, because realtors don't have that different thought process like I do. So they're coming to me perhaps after they've talked to a realtor that didn't want the listing because it wasn't a pretty property.
So the sellers are coming to you because you're marketing directly to them. So you're basically eliminating the broker from the equation. Is that what I'm hearing?
In the majority of my transactions, yes.
So give us an example then of some of these conversations. Like, what's a recent conversation you've had with a potential seller?
There was a transaction that I'll just give you a case study because it'll be easier. The gentleman had a 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch house, 5 acres of land. He was retiring and wanted to move out of state after, within 6 days of retiring. When I looked at the property, I always give people multiple offers. So I'll give them a cash offer, and then I'm going to give them 1 or 2 or 3 different creative structures. He had 2 mortgages on the property totaling about $132,000, and my cash offer would have been $120,000. The property itself, if you did a complete rehab on it, and when I say rehab, it really was just cosmetically challenged. So you could have easily spent $40,000 to $50,000 to update the entire thing. It would have been worth about $250,000. I was talking to him about what his bottom line was, and he really wanted $150,000 to walk away. So my cash offer didn't work. And I asked him, I said, if I don't buy the property from you, what are your other options? He said, well, I would have to list it with a real estate agent. And because he's moving from Wisconsin to South Dakota, and this was actually in the fall of the year, last year, he would have to hire somebody to do the snow removal potentially and take care of the yard and all those things we have fun with here in the upper part of the United States. And along the way, he still has all of his expenses. He still has to make his mortgage payments and taxes and utilities and everything else. So I said, well, what if I was willing to give you $150,000 for your house, but not for the next 6 months? And he had to think about that a little bit. And of course, he asked some questions. Basically, I structured it where I put an option in place for the same 6-month time frame that he would have listed with a real estate agent. Okay. Now, the next part of it is I need to be able to have use of the building so I can come in and do what I feel is necessary to make it sellable. Right. So we do that using a lease. And I said, well, what would you like to get for a monthly rent payment? I'm not going to live here, but I need to have a lease, which gives me the ability to come in and use the property and improve it as I deem necessary to make it sellable. And he said, honestly, if I just had the utilities paid, that would be fine. Because again, if he listed with a real estate agent, he would have to be paying all these expenses. We finally settled on, I took a lease, I paid utility costs, and I paid about $225 a month, which was his real estate taxes on a monthly basis. So, Brian, would you rent a 3-bedroom, 2-bath on 5 acres for $225 a month plus utilities?
I think that's kind of a no-brainer there.
No-brainer, right? Okay. So remember I said it could be worth 250 if I did a full renovation to it. But the reality was I just wanted to do enough to it so that it would pass a home inspection. Okay. And sell it for less than 250 because my strike price is 150. So we moved forward on the deal. He retired. We signed the papers. He moved 6 days later. I came in. There was some leakage in the basement, which we had to take care of. And there was a few other mechanical, just some, light electrical things, no big deal. 5 days we were on site, spent $2,000 in labor and material, and we put the property on the market for $200,000 and had multiple showings scheduled within the first hour it was on the market. Got a full price offer. We actually got offers above full price, but I did accept the first offer that came in because it was my friend who's a real estate broker. It was her buyers. They were extremely clean, no inspections, good financing, good down payment. So I ended up clearing $36,000 on that deal on a $2,000 investment. And start to finish, we were in that project for 37 days from when I took possession to when I had it sold. And I never actually took ownership of that property. I just controlled it.
Did you then assign the purchase agreement to the buyer, or did you do a double close on that?
So I did neither. And here's how it shook out, and I'll tell you why. I could have done that. I could have assigned my option, and they could have assigned it and sold my option directly to them, and they could have closed direct with the current owner. Or I could have double closed. Double closing can be a problem if the buyer is using FHA financing or some other government-backed loan programs that have seasoning of title requirements. So that could be a challenge. But what I actually do is I secure my options using a mortgage, which is not very common, because I could record my option on public record, but I don't want to do that. I don't want the whole world seeing what my terms are in my option. I could record a memorandum of option, which would be fine too, but I record a mortgage securing the option for a couple specific reasons. Can you have any idea, Brian, why that would make sense?
Does it season it for the next buyer's financing purposes? I'm not really sure why.
Let's say I just record the option and this seller decides to not sell to me, especially if I'm in a double close situation. And because he's going to see the closing statements, he's going to know. And we had these conversations up front, so it wasn't like this was a big surprise. But if he saw I got a buyer for $200,000 a week after he agreed to sell to me for $150, and he started changing his mind or deciding, I really don't want to sell to Derek, what is my recourse?
So the mortgage really helps cement your call on the property there.
Right. My recourse, if I just secured it with an option and recorded the option, would be go to court and sue him for performance using the option, which means it goes before a judge and we're arguing about contract law. We're arguing about the intent of the document and how does that judge perceive what we wanted to have happen? What's the judge's opinion, right? Well, I don't like putting anything in front of a judge to have their opinion. Now, when I secure an option using a mortgage, now if it goes before a judge, it's a foreclosure. It's very black and white, right? It was pledged as collateral, securing an option. The seller is refusing to let me exercise my option. Therefore, I'm foreclosing. Okay. So that is one main reason. The other reason I love it is I actually listed that property as the power of attorney for the current owner. Okay. So by doing it that way, when my buyer is going through title and going through their underwriting, everything jives. It all makes sense to their lender. The current owner of record, who's owned it for many, many, many years, is selling it direct to them with me as POA. How do I get paid? I get paid as a mortgage payoff on the closing statement. Okay. So there's never any red flags to any underwriting. There's nothing that's trying to trick anybody. It's all above board. It's all documented. And that is why I do it the way I do it.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. If you're thinking of leaving your W-2 job and becoming a full-time real estate investor, one of the greatest costs you must consider is healthcare for you and your family. When I made this transition myself, I found the whole healthcare insurance process to be confusing and frustrating. That's why I'm glad I met Chad Creasy at RCB and Associates. Chad is a professional health insurance agent who helps real estate investors and small business owners understand and choose their best healthcare options. And best of all, his services are covered by the insurance company and won't cost you a dime. If you live in Michigan and are expecting a change in your healthcare insurance coverage for any reason, or losing employer coverage or transitioning into Medicare, then you owe it to yourself to contact Chad Creasy at rcbassociatesllc.com. So let me ask you this, because you're recording it as a mortgage. Doesn't that then put the seller in jeopardy? Because if you don't go through with any sort of purchase, then he owes you this 150. I mean, what is the mortgage on? Does he owe you money if you don't perform?
No. So a mortgage is nothing more than a security instrument. It's typically tied to a note, a promissory note, right? So it says if you don't live up to the terms of your promissory note, then the property is pledged as collateral and can be foreclosed upon. In this case, it's pledged as collateral to the option where I've got 6 months on this deal to exercise my option. If I don't exercise my option within the 6-month time frame at my choice, then the mortgage gets satisfied and it's over. But if I do exercise my option and I live up to everything that we agreed upon and he refuses to sell to me, that is where the mortgage can be used as leverage, because he secured to the property his promise to allow me to buy the property for $150,000 in this particular deal.
It sounds like you're very adept at coming up with creative solutions to work with sellers, but you're also coming up with creative ways to protect your interest in those agreements as well. Is that a technique you use every time, or do you have different techniques that help protect your interest when you strike these sorts of deals?
Well, so that's one type of deal, right? Like there's always going to be different strategies depending on how many layers of structure we have. So I call it layers. When people talk to me about creative deals, purchasing a property subject to is not creative. Purchasing a property with a note and a mortgage is not creative, or a lease and an option. And all these are just ways of taking control or purchasing. What I feel like is creative is when you take these different strategies and you stack them in order to solve a problem for somebody, right? So I might buy a property subject to the seller's mortgage, turn around and bring in a financial friend with $20,000 or $30,000 from their retirement account, secure that with either an option or a participating promissory note, fix up the property, and then lease option it to an end buyer for 1 to 2 years. See, that is what I consider creative. We've gone through the gamut of the whole deal, and everybody in that scenario that I just mentioned comes out with what they wanted, and it's a win-win-win deal.
Can you give us another example of how you've layered those together in the past?
Sure. Bought a property, and I'm going to kind of make the numbers up a little bit because I don't have it right in front of me, but bought a 3-bedroom house. The seller wanted about $105,000, and it needed to make it into something I could lease option out. It needed about $5,000, kind of a good cleaning, paint job, some mechanicals fixed up. And it would be worth 120 when it was done. So not a lot of equity in this property, right? She had a first mortgage of roughly $65,000, and she really needed $10,000 of move out money she was supposed to move out of state. So running through the numbers, I took over her $65,000 mortgage, subject to, gave her $10,000 worth of cash. She carried back the remainder balance. I did agree to $105,000 purchase price. Okay. So she agreed to carry back in a second position at, I believe it was a $220 a month payment with 0% interest until paid in full. So the biggest problem I had, Brian, was I didn't really want to use my own money. Okay. So brought in a financial friend, and he brought $20,000 to the table, gave him 6% quarterly interest only payments and 20% of the equity in the property someday in the future when I decide to sell. Then we fixed up the property. We put lease option tenants into the property. They gave me about $5,000 down, $1,000 a month payment. They had a 2-year lease option to purchase the property. Year 1 sets the purchase price. Year 2, I always put an appreciation bump into their purchase price, all documented from the beginning. So the reason behind that methodology is I don't want them just resting for a year and 10 months and then starting to try and figure out how they're going to buy it, because they can gain some equity if they get this, bought within year 1. So the way that all shook out, ultimately, my first buyers fell apart. So I had to put in another set of tenant lease option buyers into the property. But the whole transaction took about 2.5 years. And so the deals I'm talking about today, these have all been done within the last 3.5 years. So it's been in this current market. It's not 10 years ago. Okay. But it all worked out as it was planned. And I gained a little bit of appreciation because the first buyers fell apart. I was able to sell it for more than I would have if the first buyers had performed on their contract.
What are your parameters? Like when you look at an opportunity, is there a certain dollar amount that you want to make sure you're able to get out of it, a certain return on investment, or just is it more you don't want to have to use your own money, and as long as it can be a win-win for other people's money, you're willing to do it?
The way you described it, the answer would be it depends. It is case by case, deal by deal. In this particular case, I was into it for nothing out of my pocket. So my return is infinite cash on cash, but my return on time is not infinite. So it factors into how much work does the property need. I don't like doing these deals if the house needs a $30,000 or $40,000 rehab, because it financially doesn't make sense. I'm tying up too much cash for too long. These deals work really good when you can walk into them and they're basically livable. They just need a good cleaning, maybe some paint, fix up some mechanicals. I really enjoy them at that point. In fact, I did one in April of this year, and that one I bought at $5,000. I'm sorry, $10,000 down, $500 a month payments at 0% interest with a 5-year balloon. And I did that in April of this year. So still, when rates were low and arguably the best market we've had in a long time, right? So it can be done, but that was a case where it fit the seller's needs. They owned it free and clear. They didn't want a chunk of money. And instead of me giving them a lower cash offer, I increased what I was willing to pay them in exchange for the 0% interest rate. So that factors in, Brian, because they were going to end up paying capital gains because they were selling it for more than what they bought it for. If we built in a higher interest rate, let's call it a 5% interest rate, the portion of the interest coming back to them is going to be taxed at an ordinary income tax rate versus a capital gains rate. So increasing the sales price increases my tax basis. So I have less capital gain when I resell it. It doesn't give me any tax deduction for mortgage interest because I'm not paying mortgage interest, but it keeps more money in their pocket, I guess is the best way to look at it. And that's how we talk about these numbers with sellers. There also is that possibility that and this is between a seller and their accountant, I never get in the middle of it, but there are some exceptions to the IRS rules that say there's an imputed interest rate. I used to go into them and now I just don't, because if they changed last week, I wouldn't necessarily keep up with it, right? But there are exceptions to where you can sell a property without charging an imputed interest rate.
When you sit down to talk with the sellers, what are some of the key questions you ask so you can dial in on what it is that they really want?
I need to know how much debt they have. I need to know what they're going to do moving forward. Are they going to go and buy another house? Are they going to rent their next house? Especially if I'm going to take over their property subject to their mortgage, because it's going to stay on their credit. So we need to know. I don't want to set them up for failure. I'd like to know what they're going to do with the proceeds. If they own a property free and clear and they're going to get several $100,000, great. What's your plans for that money? Okay. If they are in distress, is it financial distress or is it property distress? Big difference. Sometimes these houses don't need much work at all. Like the first case study I talked to you about, that gentleman was just moving out of state and did not want to deal with realtors or people coming through his house or any of that. It was not a property distress. It was an emotional, it wasn't even a financial distress. It really was an emotional distress. He didn't want to deal with it. And he had his dollar amount that he would be happy with if he got that. So we need to get to that point as quickly as possible, Brian. I like to do it over the phone because I work a very large area. So I don't want to be driving 100 miles to go meet with a homeowner that I may or may not actually do a deal with. So I've just gotten really good at doing it over the phone. By the time I actually go and meet with somebody in person, I'm 80 to 90% sure this deal's moving forward. And now it's just verifying the condition of the property.
Derek, how do you get a seller to open up about what they really need when you're talking with them?
Absolutely, Brian. What I really like to do within the first 2 minutes of any conversation on the phone or in person, but especially on the phone, is let them know what we can do for them. So I'm going to give you my little elevator pitch, Brian. You're the seller. Okay. So I'm going to say something like this. Brian, we buy houses in several different ways. All cash is not a problem, but that's typically going to be our lowest offer. If that doesn't meet your needs, we could look at other strategies. If you have debt, we could take over your payments for you. If you don't have debt, we could make payments to you over time. In some cases, we could just lease your property and buy it at a future date. That usually comes into play with like landlords who are trying to offset some capital gains. I tell you all this, Brian, so you know there's multiple ways we can help you today, but I am going to have to ask you some questions that most people wouldn't ask. Is that okay? End of elevator pitch. Okay. So, Brian, I'm asking them permission to be able to talk to them about stuff they normally wouldn't like. And now when I ask them, well, do you have any debt on the property? They understand why I'm asking, because how could I ever come to a conclusion without knowing that? Or a solution, I should say, not a conclusion. How could I come to a solution without knowing how much debt they have to work with? Or is it free and clear? Or where are they moving? Right? So if your listeners can figure out a script that's natural to them, that sounds natural coming out of their mouths, and use it over and over again, people open up. And then shut up and listen. That's the biggest part. If somebody wants to take half an hour to tell you their life story versus 3 minutes, you have to be open to listening.
Tell our listeners how they could get a hold of you, find out more about you, or any of the materials that you have to offer.
Couple things. I am currently authoring a book and co-authoring a second book. It is not getting published until right around the beginning of the next year or late this year. So I'd love to be able to give that to your audience. I'll give you some contact information at the end. I also host a conference on an annual basis. It's called the Generations of Wealth. The next one is coming up in February in Cancun, Mexico. And if you're from where you and I are from, Brian, it's kind of cold here in February, so it's nice to go south. But that Generations of Wealth conference is an advanced strategies and networking event. It's a 5-day event. We have speakers from 9 a.m. to 1 o'clock each day. Nobody is pitching from the stage. It's not that kind of event. And then from 1 o'clock through dinner, that's the networking portion. You're getting to know all these different people from all over the country. And then we come back in the evenings and we have these town hall sessions, which are more interactive, more like case studies or just different things. But what I love about this is I encourage people to bring their children, especially ages 10 and up. We don't charge anybody to have their kids there. They can sit in on anything they want. Any of the actual speakers or town hall session does not matter. Now, the kids are not necessarily going to understand what the topics are, but the point of this is they're building a network of other kids from around the country who have parents that are entrepreneurial like us. They're doing what I didn't do until I was well into my 30s. And I've seen it changing my own kids' lives and the other kids that they are now, friends with and networked with. So I'm really proud of that. And so you can look that conference up at gowvoyage.com. Generations of Wealth is gowvoyage.com. You can get the free version of my books, the electronic version from me. Just shoot me an email, Derek@bestreifunding.com. I think Brian will have it in the show notes. And Derek spelled Derek. And as soon as our books are published, I'll send that out to anybody that wants it for nothing. Again, that's electronic version for free. I've just really enjoyed teaching, and I learned all of this because of necessity. What my wife and I went through, and we realized what a blessing that was after the fact. I mean, it didn't feel like a blessing in 2007. Now we're able to help and teach other people, and that's truly what I love doing.
Final wrap-up question in 30 seconds. What's your favorite hack or app?
My favorite app is Marco Polo. It's a video chat app that we use to stay in touch with all of our members of our masterminds that we run. And I love it because it's super easy to use, but it still gives you the one-on-one, face-to-face conversation at your leisure. And it's been around for a long time, but we've been using it the last 2 years. I really like that. I use it with my assistant. If I've got something quick for my assistant to do, I don't know. I really enjoy it.
Derek, it's been a real pleasure talking with you about these creative strategies and the way you layer them together to work with the seller and come up with a solution that's a win-win for all. Thank you so much for sharing them with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB and Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.